In other news, US President Kamala Harris starts a week-long trip to Africa on Sunday. The White House says her visit aims to strengthen business ties and expand joint ventures with the continent.
The trip will strengthen the United States partnership throughout Africa and advance our shared efforts on security and economic prosperity. Throughout the trip, in partnership with African governments and the private sector, the Vice President will advance efforts to expand access to the digital economy, support climate adaptation and resilience, and strengthen business ties and investment, including through innovation, entrepreneurship, and the economic empowerment of women.
Well, the Vice President is set to meet with the leaders of Ghana, Tanzania and Zambia, with some media reports claiming that Harris will address China's engagements in debt restructuring as well as other economic issues during her tour. Well, the Vice President's visit follows a slew of other visits by top US officials, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen also having visited Africa since the beginning of the year. Now, the trips come as Washington seeks to counter the rising influence of Russia and China on the continent, with Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also conducting a tour there. Let's cross live now to discuss this with international policy consultant Akol Dok, joining us now from South Sudan. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. Now, Kamala Harris is the third top US official to visit the African continent since the beginning of the year. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has also conducted extensive tours of Africa, and Moscow has also hosted African leaders, I believe, last week. In your opinion, what's this increasing interest in Africa by the likes of Russia and China and America?
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I think the increasing interest is due to the fact that China has really began to penetrate into the African economic sector, particularly to the natural resources. If you look at the level of investment and the level of partnership that China has across Africa, is vast. In most countries, I mean, if you look at from big countries such as Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, to smaller economies such as South Sudan, Chad. So the Chinese have really penetrated into the African market, and they've maintained very strong economic relationships with these countries. And they've received billions of dollars worth of contracts to build infrastructure, to do business, and to do industrialization. So this has caught the eye of the United States, and has caught the eyes of other countries because they believe that is becoming hegemonic, meaning China is now taking over with the final frontier, which is Africa.
Mm-hmm. And which way do you think Africa's leaning? Do you think this trip by the US Vice President is going to sway some nations in Africa to lean towards the US or to China? What do you think the outcome of this visit is going to be?
I think the outcome will be nothing, because when you talk about approaching a sovereign country, Africa is not a country. Africa is 54 countries. And they're diverse in their own nature, diverse in ethnicity, diverse in language, culture. But if you look at Kamala Harris is visiting Ghana, which is part of ECOWAS, Tanzania, which is part of the East Africa community, and Zambia, which is part of the SADC community. And the biggest discussion is going to be debt restructuring, because if you look at it, Zambia was the first African country to default on a sovereign debt during COVID-19, and it's working with most of its creditors are who? Are the Chinese. That was Zambia. Ghana is having its own economic challenges right now as we speak. It has debt distress issues and facing these types of challenges. And Zambia now had issues with a lot of its debts with China. But what Africa wants, Africa has to sit down as individual countries and develop a unique relationship with the United States. And the United States has to take this relationship seriously. They should send the president. Because if the only time they send officials when China's moving, then they're not serious. And they should offer something to these African countries, offer them investment, offer them funds, offer them loans. But instead, America is known as paternalistic, is issuing sanctions, and is sanctioning African businessmen, African leaders, and it is always constantly accusing them of failing and being undemocratic. And this has turned Africans away from America to China.
Mm-hmm. Now, just to play devil's advocate here, there have been some critics of China's role in the African continent, saying that they're providing money quite cheaply and getting some African nations into a so-called debt trap. What would you say to those allegations?
Those allegations are valid, but then the question I always counter with people when they say the debt trap. I mean, as an African, I feel that some of these loans, some of these debts are questionable. But what is the counter? What is the alternative? If you're an African president, an African head of state, and you want to build roads, you want to build hospitals, you want to build airports, you want to do economic development, and you go to the West, and the West is telling you, no, you're undemocratic, you're a dictator, criticizing you, they sanction you, and you turn east and you find that you have another partner who's offering you a package to build an airport, to build roads, to build infrastructure, to build power plants. You're going to go with somebody who does the development. Granted, yes, some of those terms may not be favorable, but what is the alternative? And this is the question I always pose to many people in the West is, what are you going to offer to counter China? It has to be an economic package. It cannot be paternalism. It cannot be sanctions. It cannot be accusing people of being undemocratic. You have to offer economic packages to these people because you lack economic leverage on African countries, and Chinese have economic leverage.
Well, Akol Dok, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. It's been very good to have you on the programme.
All right, thank you for having me.